This week is The Blood of the Martyrs by Vincent Benet, who is a poet who was famous for, Walter?
An epic poem of the pre-Civil War, or called John Brown's Body, about the radical abolitionist John Brown, who, in some ways can be thought to have triggered the war or at least presaged it. And then he's also famous for a short story that was turned into plays and other things called The Devil and Daniel Webster, which is a kind of retelling of the Faust myth in American terms.
Almost every country has to have somebody who does Faust,
right.
But not in German. So this story, do you want to recap it? I started off thinking, okay, where's this going? But then, it's quite a powerful story. So what's the story about, Walter?
So it's important to know that it was written in the 1930s, the late 1930s, because it refers generally and vaguely, without ever naming it, to some kind of foreign government or regime. People might take it to be the Nazi regime or
Franco,
fascist Spain, exactly. But it's never specified. Anyway, the story begins from the point of view of a man in prison for some political crime. We find out that he's a scientist, a famous scientist, a Nobel Prize winning biochemist, in fact, who is being held as some kind of enemy of the state in this state that's not named. And he's contemplating his execution, or, the end of his life.
I mean, the story starts off the man who expected to be shot lay with his eyes open.
Yes, the man who expected to be shot. He sits there and he sort of reflects on his past. And we realize that what got him in trouble was that he was a famous professor at a university, and some of his students started to become radicalized in a way that seems kind of left-wing, basically. Their issues, as they're described, seem more on the left than the right. And he was thought to have somehow, egged them on or been in league with them in some way. By some process of association, he was brought in and imprisoned. And there's a real resonant line in there where he says, he never thought it could happen to him, but he was wrong about that.
Mm-hmm.
So now he's sort of brought us up to speed with his thoughts about why he's there. And like I say, it's basically guilt by association. And then he's called by the warden or whatever to meet with the head of the prison. And he goes down there to that office and he sits down, and the dictator of the country is there in the office.
The general.
There's a general, but there's a supreme leader too, the dictator. At first, he can't believe that he's real. He thinks he's just the poster that he's seen so many times. In other words, Big Brother himself is there in the office. And they basically offer him a deal. And they say, we're getting international criticism for your imprisonment. You're a leading internationally famous scientist, and we want to be perceived as pro-science. And we look forward to a day when our national science, and they suggest that there's some kind of peculiar science that the regime will invent, unlike the science that comes from Aristotle and Francis Bacon, that this guy is going to lead. In the Soviet Union, they call it Lysenkoism. The idea that the socialist man will have a new way of understanding nature and so on. But anyway, they offer him this deal. And the heart of the story is really his inner debate on whether or not a thinker, a scientist, a detached person owes more to his work or than he does to his conscience in this sense. He keeps saying, well, of course, yeah, I'll sign it. I'll go along with it. And there's both what he says outwardly and what he thinks. We're privy to both tracks. And his reasoning is that man is not free. It's childish to expect to be free. All you can really do is your work in life. There's always going to be a Caesar. He says this explicitly. You're going to render unto Caesar whatever is necessary to give you the space to lead your life. So in other words, he's not a martyr. And in fact, he makes fun in his mind of people who, volunteer for the firing squad or, bravely confront the regime. That was never his intention. He doesn't know what he's doing here because he's not one of those people. He's not an ideologue. He's not a revolutionary. He's not a rebel. And so you're led to believe that he's going to compromise, and he does. But at some point, he says something that's not quite as ferociously pro-regime as expected. He sort of couches one of his agreements with them in less than enthusiastic terms, and they detect.
Yeah, this is a key part of the story. Yeah, so
yes,
so they want him to sign the declaration, but then they tell him you're going to get up, you're going to give a speech, and you're going to, through your science, you're going to prove that all of these things are true that we say. And he says, no, you don't understand. That's not how science works. We do experiments, we stand by, we watch to see what happens, and if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I can't tell you in advance what I'm going to be able to prove. And
yeah, I can't guarantee that my experiments will prove that your regime and your ideology are the truth of the universe.
Right. Exactly. And from there, what happens?
Well, they say, oh, I see you're not quite as reformed as we thought you were. You're still harboring these ideas about truth outside the party and outside the state. We won't have that. And they just condemn him.
Yep, take him out and shoot him.
And they take him out and shoot him. And his last thought, as he's facing the firing squad, indeed, the thought which causes him to not even notice the bullets flying, is a memory of the faces of his students. And so it's a rather didactic story in that it has a point, and it's a pretty unmistakable point, which is that you owe more to the truth, and particularly to those you've taught to respect the truth, than you do to the state, any state. He becomes a martyr, in other words, despite himself, but a martyr for a cause he didn't realize would be at stake. He never quite expected that they would say, you will have to lie about the nature of the universe, not just about politics, not just about whether you like us or not, like at the end of Catch-22, where they said, we have only one request,
like us.
Like us,
yep.
You won't even have, remember 1984 hasn't been written yet. This is in the late 30s. So, in the end of 1984, the capitulation is, I love Big Brother.
Mm-hmm.
He's willing to say, I love Big Brother in this story. What he's not willing to say is that I can prove by experiment that you guys are right about everything.
That everybody loves Big Brother, right? Yeah.
Right.
And it's funny that you bring up Catch-22. I thought about Catch-22 because there's that line, take him out and shoot him. And that it reminds me of that moment in that book where I think it's General Dreidel. He was upset with Major Danby, who was a similarly like middling level figure who was disobeying an order on some logical basis. And he said, take him out and shoot him. And the two corporals that looked at each other, none of them had ever taken Major Danby out and shot him before. They didn't know, because they didn't know what to do, right? But here, you know, I interpreted it slightly differently. It's not that you owe more to the truth, I thought is what it was saying. I think what this story said to me was, you have no choice in the matter. If you are planning in your head that you are going to step aside and let things, political events take place, and that you're just going to try to, go ahead and live your life and do your work and focus on that and the good that it can do. And there are a lot of people who do think that way. Frankly, they think, there's a way for me to work around this. And
48% of me thinks that way.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of us think this way. But when people start down this road of authoritarianism, it turns out to be limitless. It does not stop at the border of your personality or of your work routine or any of those things. It demands everything of you, and you will eventually have to make a choice, whether you like it or not. And that to me is what the story is about. This person who does not want to rebel, who has the instincts to be the correct kind of citizen. It's similar to what I think Orwell was saying in 1984, except in 1984, the character Winston is resolved to keep hidden his thoughts, and the idea of the book is that you can't. Like they will find it out, right? By your behavior, it will come out. Here, it's more like,
and by scaring you, by having rats nibble at your eyes.
Right. But here, there's not even this idea that you can even attempt to keep it secret. It's just, it will come out, and you will be forced to make a decision. And if you make the wrong decision, like he throws something at the leader, right? There's a key moment in the book, in the story.
Yes.
Yeah, he picked up an inkwell and he threw it in the dictator's face. So that was the end of him.
And he respects the dictator for not reaching to wipe the ink off his shirt first.
Right.
He sort of respects him for his composure in not being a mere mortal. And in a weird way, it's hard to tell about the realism of the story is greater at the beginning than it is toward the end, because the progression to asking him to kind of forsake science totally is a little quick for one interrogation. So it seems a little allegorical as it goes on.
Yeah, you don't have a hint that that's coming.
No, you don't. You don't have a hint that that's coming. But let's think about this story. It's in the mid-30s. We're not that long after Franz Kafka. It's a weirdly kind of Americanized, Yankee version of Kafka, where you don't know what kind of regime it is. It's sort of generalized in a shadowy way, just like the trial or the castle. You don't quite know who the powers are. It's a little bit more specific. It's a little more literal than Kafka. But what he's telling you is that totalitarianism, which hadn't, I don't think, even been named yet in the late 30s, really. Maybe it has. That's a good thing to look up. But they had not yet equated fascism and communism and given them this common title of totalitarianism. But totalitarianism is total. There is no belief that you will be able to hold from the before times. Once you've been unburdened of the past, you've been unburdened of everything, including biochemistry. Because basically the guy's essential error is to think that he can make a deal that doesn't involve absolute capitulation of everything he believes about the world. And this is a point at which there were a lot of Americans still thinking we might not have to go to war with Hitler. And we were about to become an ally of the Soviet Union. He was a little bit ahead of his time here in saying, no, these systems are not going to brook any independence of mind whatsoever.
And his dilemma is exactly the dilemma of, Yossarian, right? He probably would have done anything to get home and escape with his life. But the one thing they asked of him is the one thing he could not possibly do, which is like them, right?
Right. Not just say, but they asked not just that he say in Catch-22, not just that he say he likes them, but that he actually likes them.
Right. And I can't. There's no way for me to do that. And this is the problem that a lot of us have, which is, okay, I can go along with this, that, and the other thing, but then you ask me to go along, like, it can't come out of me, you sort of organically, this love for your stupid way of looking at the world. I can't, there's no way for me to comply.
Right. So in other words, what he's saying is you can't negotiate with totalitarian ideologies and regimes. You can only capitulate. And they are not asking for time. You can't play for time. You can't preserve your career, but give everything else up. Ultimately, they will ask for every single thing, including the foundation of your belief system about how the universe works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's naive to think that you can, I can still be a scientist. I can still have my career. I can still have students.
One last point that I had reading this, thinking of his dilemma, this is going to sound strange, but it really reminded me of Eric Garner. So, the guy who was killed by police in Staten Island. Mm-hmm. Garner was actually, he was an ex-con, and mm-hmm. he was not what you would call a rebel at that stage of his life. He thought he had discovered a way out, right? Like selling untaxed cigarettes. The way he put it, it was like felony money, misdemeanor time. He had a really funny way of describing it. And all he wanted to do was sit in his corner, like literally just this little slice of the world, and do that thing. And he wasn't going to get in anybody's way. He didn't give anybody lip, nothing, right? But between the police and the streets, they took every piece of space that he had to operate. And when he would go outside, if he went to the laundromat, he might get pulled over. They would reach into his pocket. They would take every dollar that he had, and they would say, come to the station with a work slip if you want that money back. If you can prove you made it legally. If he made any more money, he might get robbed by another gang on the street. But mostly it was the police over and over again hassling him for 9,000 different things. And despite the fact that this part of his life, he was willing to make almost any kind of compromise, including repeatedly paying, large sums to defend himself for ridiculously small charges. Ultimately, there was one day where they asked him to do something he just couldn't, get in the car for something you didn't do. And so I just think that there are people who you may think that you're willing to bend as far as possible to comply. And, this kind of totalitarianism, though, is different because it asks not just for your outward compliance, but for your soul and for your intellectual freedom. And from there, there's truly no escape once that comes into play.
Well, I'll one last thought. It's a story about disbelief. It's a story about denial. And that theme starts here. Toward the beginning, and this is the line I mentioned earlier. To the last, he had not believed that they would touch him. Well, he had been wrong about that. And he just can't believe that he's guilty of anything. He can't believe that anyone could think he's guilty of it. He can't believe once he's imprisoned that they would kill him for it. Then when they offer to make a deal, he can't believe that they won't be reasonable about the deal. Oh, of course I'll give your speech and I'll, but they demand that he betray everything, science, everything. So it's about the road of denial, which allows us to be put into these situations at which a process in which every step we think, well, we can negotiate something later, or I'll preserve this part and give away that part. And, it's all very well for science. It's all very well for short story writers and creative writers to talk about this kind of absolutism, and to make up these scenarios in which if you give a little, you lose everything, or, we're all engaged to some extent in negotiation with powers that we don't agree with, whether if we work at a company, we are. We often pull over for cops not thinking we did anything, but hell, we're going to do it. It's not worth defying the cops when I know I really wasn't speeding. But the place of fiction is to make us consider ultimate cases and not practical cases sometimes. And he's saying your disbelief is your enemy. If you can't believe it's going to happen, it will.
It will. Yeah.
And if you're not prepared, see, he should be a martyr from the beginning. It's his foolishness which makes him think that there's any way out once they've put their finger on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that he thinks he's going to reserve one tiny shred of self-respect or past beliefs or respect for the truth. It is a fantasy. And it's a story about don't fantasize.
Yeah. Yep. And this was going on in the 30s where, this was the ultimate extreme cases. They were happening all over the world, right? Whether it was in Germany, whether it was in Spain, whether it was in Russia.
Great point, Matt, because at the point he wrote this, there would have a lot of people would have said, don't be alarmist. Because the world was still trying to negotiate with these powers, whether it be Stalin, Hitler, whatever, Franco, Mussolini. We didn't have a Holocaust yet. We didn't have a World War II yet. We didn't have, having to chase Hitler into his bunker. We didn't have the Great Terror. But they all came.
Mm.
So to say that this fiction writer was being a little imaginative is absolutely wrong. He was just a realist ahead of his time.
Yeah, just like Hunter Thompson said, the best fiction is truer than any journalism. And, this is another example of that. And food for thought during this fraught time. So anyway, great choice, Walter. Thank you. And thanks for hanging out and talking about this. And we'll see you very soon, folks, at minimum on Monday.
Okay.